want to talk to you tonight about spirituality and politics. Spirituality and politics has long been a very favorite subject of mine. I feel very strongly about it. And so I want to talk to you tonight about the context of spirituality in relation to politics, and particularly to the significant role that you as Iowans hold this year and every 4 years. I want you to kick ass for Bernie Sanders, basically. I'm going to give you a spiritual reason why. I'd like to start with talking about the history of the United States of America. First of all, I want to talk about the history of democracy. When you see the founding of the United States, it's the first time that a country was actually founded on a democratic principle. The first country actually founded as a democracy. Now, when you talk about anything, I myself am a transcendental meditation practitioner. I'm a student of A Course in Miracles, so my dedication to spiritual principle and spirituality, I think, is pretty well established for those who know my work. And what I am committed to as a spiritual seeker is the idea that before you do anything, you need to be grounded in a state of being that is aligned with something more important than the realm of doing. And so I want to talk tonight about political activism when grounded and aligned with a level of consciousness that not only empowers the activism, but gives it a larger moral and spiritual authority. Now, democracy and the founding of a country based on democratic principle was important not only in the political history of the world. We know that it was important in the political history of the world, obviously. It was a radical move. It affected the Western civilization and continues to affect the world today. But it was also, and primarily, from I think the view of many of us, it was important not only as a political move on the planet. It not only had to do with the political furtherance of the human race, it had to do with the spiritual furtherance of the human race. Why is that? Because the founding of democracy was a direct repudiation. The American Revolution was a direct resistance and repudiation of an aristocratic system. Now let's talk about what that means exactly. An aristocratic system which had held sway within the Western Hemisphere for centuries, certainly in Europe, was one in which it was deemed, a certain group of people were deemed entitled. That was the social contract. A certain small group of people were deemed entitled. They were entitled to the land, they were entitled to the money, they were entitled to all resources of the country, educational opportunity, and so forth. No one else was deemed entitled, which actually meant that everyone else was basically little more than a serf on some level to those who were deemed entitled. So, I once heard Muhammad Yunus, who is, of course, the founder of the Grameen Bank, and he was talking about the deeply poor. We have 1 billion people on the planet who are called deep poverty. They live on like $1.25 and less a day. And once when I heard Muhammad Yunus talking about those living in deep poverty, he likened them to bonsai trees. He said, a bonsai tree is just like every other tree. It's just that it has these confines. And so it can't get past the confines. He said that's how the poor are. They don't have, you and I don't have anything the deeply poor don't have. It's just that they have these physical confines, these physical limitations, which do not allow them to go further than a certain place. So an aristocratic system is one in which some people are basically, from a spiritual perspective, allowed to spread their wings. Their wingspan can be anything that they want it to be. But everyone who is not a member of the aristocracy has the same human potential. That's the spiritual perspective. The spiritual perspective that is so radical at the heart of democracy is the idea that it doesn't matter who your parents were, and it doesn't matter what your class is, and it doesn't matter how much money you have the same God-given potential inside you. And the whole idea of establishing a democracy was that we would, to the best of our ability, it's an ongoing experiment, it's an ongoing project, it's an ongoing journey, it's an ongoing effort, but that our commitment to the radicalism of American democracy is that to the best of our ability, we will create a society in which everyone can spread their wings as far as possible. That is the American dream. And that is the exceptionalism at the core of the American ideal. Now, America has never manifest this perfectly. But America is not a particle. America is a wave. We began with this rather extraordinary and in some ways extraordinarily horrifying dichotomy between principles which are the highest ideals that have ever been established at the core of the founding of a nation. The idea of equality under the law, the idea of a government that would broker individual liberty with a concern for the common good, the idea of religious liberty, the idea of e pluribus unum. And if you add to that which was not the first principle, now considered a first principle, not encoded in our Constitution or our Declaration, but articulated by Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, that we would be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. You put all those principles together, and on the level of consciousness, you have as resonant a field of higher consciousness and possibility as has ever been encoded into the governmental structure of a nation ever. At the same time, however, as we know, the men, and they were all men, who, ironically enough, risked their lives. Signing the Declaration of Independence was risking your life. It was an act of treason against the King of England. They risked their lives for those principles, except the of the people, by the people, for the people, which of course came later. And yet many of them, of course, they themselves were slave owners. So you had, from the beginning, highest ideals on which we purport to stand, polarized by how many of them were slave owners, the fact that slavery existed in this country, and of course the genocide of the Native Americans. But America's journey has been one in which generation after generation, and this is no less true in our generation than in any other, every generation has been inhabited by those who sought to expand our effort to embody our own ideals and to manifest our own ideals, but we have also met with the resistance of those who sought to withdraw the resources of the country from the effort to manifest our own ideals. So you begin with slavery, and then we abolish slavery. Women had no right to vote, and then women were given the right to vote. You had white supremacy as an established political, social, and economic order in the American South after the Civil War, and then there was civil rights legislation. I actually think we can add to that. Gay people were not allowed to marry, and then they were given that right to marry. So America, in this journey, has tended over time to self-correct. But the journey continues. And what has happened now is that we have subconsciously regressed to a condition of aristocracy. You can call it a plutocracy, you can call it an oligarchy, you can call it a corporatocracy, but what is most important is that we call it for what it is. It is an aristocratic system in which a few people, for whatever reason, are entitled to the major resources of the country, and we've had decades by which those major resources have been siphoned off. Policy after policy, an economic policy here, a social policy there, a tax policy there, a political policy there, by which major resources of the country have been siphoned off into the hands of a very few people. Now, just as in the human body, blood has got to circulate for the body to be healthy, in a free society, money and resources and material opportunity has got to circulate in order for the society, particularly if it is a democracy, to be healthy. What is happening today is that we are systematically and chronically withdrawing the commitment and the devotion and the dedication of the country to that which is the highest ideal of American democracy. Now, America was founded as a country, as a product and a consequence of many great factors, but they all stemmed from consciousness. I want to tell you a story that many of you, I assume, know, and that has to do with something happened with a gentleman named William Penn in London. It was in London, England, an aristocrat's carriage came by, and at that time in England, if an aristocrat's carriage came by, you had to bow. An aristocrat's carriage came by, and William Penn refused to bow. So a soldier comes up to him and he says, "What's wrong with you? Didn't you see that? That was an aristocrat's carriage. You're supposed to bow." And William Penn said, "My religion would not allow it." William Penn was a Quaker. And according to the Quakers, no man is supposed to bow before any man. Because there is an inner light within all of us. It is that which unites us and makes us all equal in the sight of God. And our job on this earth is to create on earth as it is in heaven, to create on earth to the best of our ability, that which reflects the implicate order, which is the spiritual perfection of the universe. Well, King George, who was not known for his wisdom about most anything, wanted to get William Penn out of his hair. So his idea for the way to get William Penn out of his hair was to just give him some land in America. Tell him to get out of here. Hello. And that was Pennsylvania. So William Penn, smart guy that one. William Penn, something about these Georges. What is that, do you think? So William Penn comes over to the United States, and he, of course, we all know about the Quakers in Pennsylvania, and we know how absolutely fundamental that was to the establishment of American democracy. The idea of American democracy, in large part, an expression of that Quaker vision. An expression of that Quaker vision that there is an inner light which makes all of us equal. All of us are equal, created equal by our Creator. That is in our Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. So the idea is that if all men are created equal, then on the earth our job is to create a society which to the best of our ability reflects those principles of equality. When the American Independence War was fought, the majority of people were royalists. We never move forward as a nation because the status quo wakes up one day and goes, oh, let's do it different. The majority didn't wake up one day and say, oh, let's free the slaves. The majority didn't wake up one day and say, I think we should give women the right to vote. And for that matter, the majority didn't say, let's separate from England. Social change does not occur because the status quo decides to change it, ladies and gentlemen. The status quo is happy with the way things are. Society changes not because of a horizontal move where you get enough, more and more people to agree with you by dumbing down your message. Society moves when enough people go vertical, enough people go deep. They're never the majority. They are those usually considered outrageous radicals by the status quo of their time, but they have a better idea. And because their idea is based on not just what is expedient, not just what on this group or that group wants to have happen, but on what is deeply true, then in time, history moves in that direction. Later on in the struggle for abolition, the Quakers, once again, the abolitionist movement in the United States emerged from the Quakers. Emerged from the Quakers who, because of their dedication to spiritual principle, this is what dedication to spiritual principle gives us. On one hand, it gives us an absolute, we find conditions that move against what we feel to be right intolerable. The spiritual perspective gives you an ownership of a powerful no, and it gives you an ownership of a powerful yes. Abolitionists, abolitionists and the Quakers who gave rise to abolition were not the only people who, based on religious and spiritual principle, felt that slavery was wrong. But they were the people who didn't just feel that it was wrong, they refused to go along. But it's not just the power of the no that deep spiritual conviction gives you, it's also the power of your yes. Because what the abolitionists had, what the founders had in terms of the founding of American democracy, what later the civil rights, the women's suffragettes had, and the workers for civil rights and the civil rights movement had, all based, once again, the Quakers at the center of the American War of Independence, the Quakers who were central and the emerging force for the abolitionist movement, the Quakers, all the women, so many of the women who were the leaders of the suffragette movement were Quakers, and of course Dr. Martin Luther King was a preacher from Atlanta. The whole idea of the civil rights movement coming from the Southern Christian Leadership Council, what did all those people have in common? What did the abolitionists and Dr. King and all those who have worked from a spiritual center in their political activism have in common? What is shall not be tolerated, and what can be is possible through the grace of God. And that gives you a power. So you're not moved by what the majority says. And you're not worried by what the status quo has to say, but also you are not fooled by what the status quo has to say. You see, the status quo is a weaver of tales. The stories of consciousness is a weaver of a story. Consciousness weaves a story. Spirituality weaves a story. And it is a story of the emergent possibilities for the human race. The status quo weaves a tale. And today, because the status quo in both parties is aware that we're at a point where on a certain level, Americans aren't having it anymore. So they know that. So in one party, in the Republican Party, it's very interesting. I wish that the Republicans don't have a codependent Republicans do not have a codependent relationship with the Republican establishment. Too many Democrats have a codependent relationship with the Democratic establishment. And so the Democratic establishment knows that the times are changing. So those who have made sure it does not change, those who have got it to where it is now, tell us, oh, we're going to change. And their main candidate is, we're going to change. So they used to be for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but now I get it. I used to support the Keystone Pipeline, but now I get it. I used to not be for gay marriage, but now I get it. I used to be for that war and the idea of his going to invading Iraq, but now I get it. Ladies and gentlemen, if somebody didn't get it, and now they get it, and they only got it because we got it first, that makes them a follower, not a leader. The United States of America will be led by someone. And so we are once again living at a time where the American ideal itself is at stake, where the American journey itself is at stake. Now, as we are, what every generation is, a steward of American democracy, this is as important and unfolding on the history of the planet. The founding of American democracy is as important as any social collective experiment as has ever existed. But never have the stakes been so high. What we have now, many years ago, several years ago, I went to Wyoming. And there had been these terrible fires in Wyoming back in the 1980s one summer. And what happened that summer was that there were quite a few fires that were considered at that time acceptable burns. This is an interesting thing because that particular phenomenon changed the calculus of professional firefighting. Because, and I live in California, and so I know also about the idea of fires and how dangerous and how important they are, significant they are. And I understand the concept of the acceptable burn. The acceptable burn being, if it's only until a certain point, you're better off just letting it burn. But what happened that summer was that there were too many fires that were too close to each other, that were all considered acceptable burns. And basically the whole state erupted in flames. And that's what's happening on the planet today. There are a lot of situations. You could look at the environmental disaster, you could look at ISIL, you could look at permanent war machinery, you could look at income inequality, you could look at so many areas and say, if it were only that, we could handle it. I remember hearing Bill Clinton talk about assault weapons and what some emergency room doctors had said to him. They said, if somebody comes into the ER with a gunshot wound, in a lot of cases we have a chance. It's when they come in with a whole bunch of gunshot wounds that we just can't. And so what's happening on the planet today is that there are too many things that under other circumstances we might be able to say, we can handle that. And the problem is that Americans are very, very good. Not that this is always a problem, but it poses a problem for us now, that Americans are very good with a to-do list. You just tell us what to do and we can handle it. You can liken World War II and the Nazi army and the Imperial Army of Japan to malignant tumors that were operable. They were operable, and the armies of the United States and other allied nations did a brilliant job of operating, doing invasive measures, operating on the cancer tumors of the Nazi regime and Imperial Japanese. They removed the tumors. What we have today is much more complicated. We have a cancer that has already metastasized. And the invasive measures we took, thank you very much, if anything, only spread the cancer. So today we have problems on the planet that, number one, are too many happening at the same time, and we also have a metastasis of so many of these efforts where it is not as simple as here's your to-do list. Do this and it'll be okay. Do this and it'll be okay. It is not that simple. We must take a holistic approach. And the only way to take a holistic approach is to recognize the elements not only of political activism, which could be likened to allopathic medicine. We must expand the paradigm to integrative medicine, understanding not only the powers of external manifestation, but also the powers of consciousness. That's why Martin Luther King said, we need quantitative shifts in our circumstances, but we need qualitative shifts in our souls. He said the desegregation of the American South is the political externalization of the goal of the civil rights movement, but the ultimate goal is the establishment of the beloved community. So when you look at Gandhi, who first articulated the principles of nonviolence, a spiritual paradigm for political activism, which then Dr. King went to India, he studied these principles, he brought them back to the United States for their application to the struggle for civil rights in America in the 1960s. Both of them realized that it would take more than a political revitalization of their societies. In order for those changes to occur, there would have to be a spiritual revitalization of their societies. Gandhi said we need a spiritual transformation in the Indian people. When people asked Gandhi, who is the leader of the Indian independence movement, he said the small, still voice within. So the idea of consciousness and politics is so important, and why I feel so strongly that the consciousness movement, those of us who are meditators, those of us who pray, those of us who are spiritual seekers, those of us who are into personal growth, those of us who are into recovery and so forth, we are the last people who should be sitting out the great social and political and economic issues of our day. Because if you have a clue as to what changes one life, you're the person who has some clues as to what will change this world. Because all that a society is a collection of individuals. So when Martin Luther King said that Gandhi was the first person to see love, to lift love above just the ethic of personal interaction and personal transformation and personal healing, but actually he used love as a broad-scale social force for good. That what Gandhi said, and then Dr. King articulated as well, was that love will not just heal individual relationships, and love will not just heal individual hearts, and love will not just contribute to the healing of an individual's body. Love will heal all social and political relationships as well. It is on that we must stand if we are seeking to establish the beloved community as the basis for the establishment of political democracy. Let's not talk about democracy if in fact we are a plutocracy. Let's not talk about freedom if in fact we are a surveillance state. Can we be real here? If we are not real and we do not name it, this country will not transform. Now, the status quo names it a little bit. So you have a Republican Party, and I agree with Eisenhower, I agree with President Eisenhower that the American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative. I agree that there are high-minded conservative values and high-minded liberal values, but that's not what we're seeing at play here between the Democratic and the Republican Party today. Somebody has got to be willing to name what is happening. I only know one candidate running for president who is naming what is happening. Now, this is the deal. The Republican Party at this time in their history, this is not to say the Republican Party in general, and certainly not to say this about high-minded conservative values. The Republican Party itself today is very little more than a handmaiden for the corporatocracy. And those values and those policies that emanate from that, to many of us, almost guarantee hardship. They guarantee financial hardship. They guarantee the fact that people will not have health care. They guarantee the fact that people will have a hard time getting an education. They guarantee the fact that so many kids won't even be able to have an education because they figure out my bills will be so large, why even bother? They almost guarantee, because they are such a shill for the military-industrial complex, they almost guarantee hardship of countries that we invade that didn't do anything to us and so forth. The Democratic Party, however, too often takes the view that goes like this. Oh, this is so terrible, all this pain. So we will make that pain better. We will do what we can to ameliorate the pain. Ladies and gentlemen, a courageous politics today does more than seek to ameliorate the pain. It seeks to fundamentally challenge the forces that make all that pain inevitable. But, like I said, the status quo is a weaver of tales. But consciousness is not a weaver of tales. A consciousness sees through tales. Abolitionists didn't want to hear it. They just didn't want to hear how some states could have it and some states wouldn't. You know, that's what Martin Luther King stands for. Martin Luther King says, your life begins to end on the day you stop talking about things that really matter. And so if all you're talking about is the issues, that's why the consciousness movement, too many people are like, I don't want to hear about it, I don't want to be involved in politics, I don't want to be involved in politics. You know, one young man said to me at one of my lectures once, he said, oh, Miss Williamson, you're just an aging hippie. You know, he said, what did your generation do? You were just about love, sex, and rock and roll. I said, only part of the day. I said, the rest of the day, we stopped the war. What have you done, young man? Because in my day, yeah, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the morning and late at night, and the rest of the day you were at an anti-war protest. And at those anti-war protests, we sang, all you need is love at anti-war protests. We were stoned, but that doesn't matter. That's not relevant right now. In other words, you read Alan Watts and you protested the war. You did the I Ching, you were reading. This is when I learned in the 1970s, this is when I got my mantra, my transcendental meditation mantra. We didn't see this difference between our political activism and what we were all learning spiritually. It was all one. After and if we go back into what happened here, and many of us remember this, there were people, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Eugene McCarthy, there were people at that time working within the establishment of political activism in the United States, and they were speaking higher spiritual moral values. Now, in the case of Bobby and in the case of Martin, many of us were young at the time. We weren't young enough to have power, but we were young enough to be enamored. We were young enough to get it, just like the millennials today. We got, oh my God, they're holding these lofty spiritual and moral values and philosophical beauty within the context of what could happen in our society, politically, economically, socially. These people, when we were still at a young age, were literally shot and killed in front of our eyes. Yep. And then, do not underestimate, those of you who might be too young to remember, the extraordinary psychological effect of the fact that just in case that wasn't enough, they killed the kids at Kent State to make sure we got the message. And that's unspoken message. And these were bullets that psychically shot all of us. And that unspoken message was, there will be no further protest. You will go along. You will go home now. You will do whatever you want to do in the private sector. You will be totally free in the private sector. You can buy the blue one. You can buy the yellow one. You could buy the red one. So much freedom you'll have. But leave the public sector alone. Leave it to whoever it is that wants it so bad they are willing to kill in order to control it. And that's what we did. And this most extraordinarily educated and idealistic and really fantastic generation, the baby boomers, basically at that point, did what we did. We did extraordinary things within the private sector. And many of us now are old enough to think about what it will be like on the last day of our lives. And the idea for many of us that, oh my God, on the last day of my life, I'm going to realize I didn't really do what I came here to do. The motherfuckers got me, is actually scarier to us than the thought that they might kill us if we do. And if you put the social potential of those of us who go, whoa, 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 I did get co-opted. I didn't mean to get co-opted, but I did get co-opted. If you put that social potential of all of us who are still kicking, we're still here, together with the millennials who are not having any of the status quo nonsense that they are hearing, because they don't have the historic memory of the time when the Democratic Party stood for the basic democratic principle in resistance of the corporatocracy and its agenda. They don't have that memory. I have that memory. Many of us have that institutional memory. And that is what is forming these revolutionary times in which we live. Whether it's on the right or on the left, something is happening in America. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm saying to those of you who are Democrats, I submit to you for your mature consideration, America is not going to elect in 2016 someone who represents the establishment or the status quo. They're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. Because these are times, they're not going to do it. Because anybody that represents the establishment is not going to represent the ferment of what is happening at this time. So today it is the revolutionary fervor of the abolitionists that's necessary. It is the revolutionary fervor of the civil rights movement that is necessary. It's the revolutionary fervor of the women suffragettes that is necessary. It is the revolutionary fervor of those who founded this country in repudiation of the aristocracy of the ancient regime. That is what is necessary, and that is what is coming up from the bottom of things. It's in our DNA. It's in our DNA, and it is why every few years, no matter how much America has swerved away from its own ethical center and from its commitment to its own principles, there has always been a generation that rose up and went, no, we're going to interrupt that, we are going to disrupt that, and we're going to put America back on track. And I believe with all my heart that that is what is coming up from the bottom of things today. Americans are good. We're decent people. I always love, when I travel internationally, I always love to sit next to an American on an airplane. We're cool. We're a little vulgar sort of civilization compared to some others. We're not the most sophisticated civilization, and we're not the most cultured civilization. We're not even old enough for that. But we kick ass like nobody does. You know, there are people all over the world who have loved us at certain times and roll their eyes when you mention the United States today. They just roll their eyes. But even those who do, in my experience, even those who have, even in some cases, contempt for us, who once loved us, will look at history and they will say, you know, Churchill said, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted every other option. And so, Americans today are looked at by people all over the world who, yes, do not respect us as they once did. But even those people would be the first to admit, I believe, that even though Americans get there late sometimes, get there late a lot of times, when we do get it, we slam it like nobody's business. And it's time for Americans to slam it like nobody's business. You just have so much time. You can't go several generations corrupting your food supply and be able to bring it back. We can't. You cannot answer to the times in which we live. You cannot answer to the challenges of the times in which we live. You cannot answer to the moral calling of the times in which we live. You cannot answer to your moral responsibility to your children and your children's children and your children's children, and answer to the bidding of chemical and big agricultural companies in this country. They don't go together. You can't do both. You can't stand for the corporatocracy and stand for your grandkids today. Because American capitalism, look, free market has been good to me. I've sold a few books. Free market has been good to me. So I'm not like an anti-capitalist. That's not what this is about. But America, you know, if you get it into the club, what a country. What a fantastic country to live in. But we're living at a time when not enough people can get into the club. And this is a direct attack on democracy itself. What the corporatocracy, and it's not the people, this is not about individuals. It is about the fact that if you have an economic order in which short-term economic gain, particularly for huge multinational corporations, takes precedence over a concern for the common good. When our government was meant, one of our first principles is that our government would be a broker between the protection of individual liberty, which includes economic liberty. It includes that, yeah. But that's supposed to be the balancing agent between a protection of individual liberty and a concern for the common good. But when you have the undue influence of money that we have on our system today, a legalized system of bribery, a legalized system of corporation, so that your bottom line is that the government is little more than a handmaiden to that corporate aristocracy, what you've got is a situation in which the well-being of the people are sacrificed time and time and time again. Then you no longer have a democracy. So the right to privacy, sacrificed. The right to a healthy food supply, sacrificed. The right to a healthy air, sacrificed. The right to healthy earth, sacrificed. The right to know that no one will be going to war in this country unless it is absolutely necessary is sacrificed. The right to have an education, to feel that you have a shot at an education is sacrificed. The right to health care, universal health care that every other major democracy has, sacrificed. How long before we have the same bravery, the same courage, the same chutzpah that generations before us had and say, no more, stop right there. No more, stop right there. No more slavery, no more not allowing women to get the vote, no more white supremacy, no more lynching, no more Jim Crow laws, no more using the American government as your handmaiden while you absolutely slaughter all that is most precious and beautiful about democracy in the name of short-term economic gain for a very, very, very few people. And the good news is, the real good news, I have a friend who is a billionaire, and he said to me, my taxes are so low, it's obscene. It's not like every rich person disagrees with us here. So this isn't about the rich versus the poor. This certainly isn't about class warfare. Some people say, oh, this is about class warfare. No, class warfare is that which has already been waged against the middle class and the lower classes of the United States of America. Class warfare is what is already. So there is one candidate that I know of, and he speaks from that place of what I see as moral authority. You know, traditionally in the United States, the conservative side of our political spectrum emphasized and focused on issues of personal morality. And the liberals focused on collective issues, issues of collective morality. But over the last few decades, for reasons that I don't really understand, the left started thinking it was too cool to use the M word. Very over-secularized. How this happened when you have Martin Luther King. God knows Martin Luther King didn't leave spirituality out of his conversation. Bobby Kennedy didn't leave it out of his conversation. He said, this is not just a struggle for the politics of America, it is a struggle for the soul of America. But what happened after the 60s is that whereas in the 60s, the political search, it was the beginning of my spiritual journey. It was when I first got my TM mantra. It was when I became a student of A Course in Miracles in the 70s. And the political activism, they weren't divided. But for many, many people, the two went their separate ways after that time. I always say the allopathic traditional types took the East Coast, and the consciousness people took the West Coast. And they looked with mutual derision upon the other. And those who were just into traditional politics and allopathic political activism kind of roll their eyes about those of us who are in the consciousness movement. And those of us in the consciousness movement have rolled their eyes about those in the traditional allopathic political movement, thinking, oh, these people just do not understand cause. But you know what? Today, we must come back together. So when Martin Luther King, it's not like Martin Luther King talked about political activism at the expense of what he felt was God's will for the world. It wasn't like Gandhi talked about what needed to happen externally at the expense of his larger spiritual vision for the world. But the opposite wasn't true either. Neither did they only talk about what was spiritually necessary. I'm reminded of Deepak Chopra. When Deepak says, I'm not sure you're supposed to mention Deepak in this town. I've heard different things. There he was for a minute. Anyway, put aside whatever opinions you have about him. When he said, if I want to be healthy, I want Ayurvedic medicine. I want to cultivate health. I want Ayurvedic medicine. But if I'm in a car accident, please get me to a Western hospital as fast as possible. And that's how I see it. Politics is not going to save America. Politics is not going to save the world. But if we are not careful, it will destroy things before we have a chance to save it. It's a race for time. What's happening on this planet, because that's where America is today, it's a bleeding aorta now. We need some action now. And too many times, people that I know, people I've known who are in the, and I think this is changing in the spiritual community, higher conscious movement. It's definitely changing in America. I've seen it over the last few years. But a lot of this talk, I'll meet people, well, all I want to do is be positive. I can only be positive. And because all that, I'm an empathic person. That's a new one. I've been around so long, every year it's a new word. Now it's like I'm an empath. I'm an empathic person, and I read the newspaper, and it's just too difficult for me. I'm just too sensitive. And I have to just be positive. That is so not spiritual. Because if... There is nothing holy about complacency. And there is no way to serve the Spirit without being willing to be fierce on behalf of it and being willing to be courageous. And so what is happening now is too many people think that a political conversation, I don't want to go there, it's negative. There is nothing negative about yelling fire if, in fact, the house is burning down. Now you have, I love that Paul Hawken talked about, you coined the phrase, blessed unrest. It's interesting, isn't it? If you are looking at the world today and not grieving, you're not looking. But from a spiritual perspective, if you're not simultaneously rejoicing in the infinite possibilities provided by what the infinite consciousness can do, then you are not yet aligned with the power to heal and transform all things. That's why those of us who understand both fields are so important right now. That's why at this point, for there to be those among us who are willing to both say no to what needs to be said no to, and yes to what is possible, is so deeply important. And so we have a political candidate who does what the best of the liberal tradition does. It sees collective issues in a moral context. Economic injustice is a moral issue. Mass incarceration is a moral issue. War that goes on and on and on as a permanent war machinery to do little more than serve the economic desires of the military-industrial complex is a moral issue. Corrupting our food supply is a moral issue. And you can't have a genuine spiritual context if you don't see the larger collective moral issue, because if you don't see the larger collective moral issue, you are just in part of this faux spirituality, which is just about me, with a new faux spiritual mask on it. Ultimately, spirituality is not just about me. The whole point of meditation to me, the whole point of prayer, is to drop a artificial sense of separation from the rest of life and to know that we are a part of all of life. To know that we are a part of all of life. So I say to many of my friends in Los Angeles on this food issue, I say, good luck with drinking all that all that green juice. That'll protect you. Because you know what? Even though many people from the spirituality and the consciousness movement have tried to avoid over the last few years a lot of more political issues, the truth of the matter is, if it's a public issue and it's a searing public issue, it will make its way to your private door. It will make its way, mark my word, to your private door, because a nuclear bomb, God forbid, would ruin everybody's day. So I believe that there is a way for those of us who are practitioners of whether it's meditation, prayer, 12-step recovery, personal growth, or whatever. I think that if we do not enter into the larger political conversation, we are withholding our gift. We are withholding what I believe we can contribute to. Years ago, I had in Sacramento, California, probably the night in my career that I will remember maybe above all others. I've never forgotten it, and I can't imagine that I ever will. It was during the second half, questions and answers, and the subject of abortion came up. And my first thought, and I'm sure many of you know or can certainly imagine, if you want to feel a psychic rip in the room, mention abortion. And my first thought was, get off the topic. And then my second thought was, we're here to heal. You don't get off the topic. In the Course in Miracles says, you bring the darkness to the light. You cannot bring the light to the darkness. You have to look at the shadow. You have to look at the darkness. You have to release it. And so this is what I said. I said, I know many of us here have very passionate pro-choice views. And there are many people in this room have passionate anti-choice views. But God really doesn't need us to have press releases on his behalf. So the spiritual mind is not a mind that is filled with opinions. The spiritual mind is the mind that is empty. You present an empty rice bowl to God. It says in the I Ching about the Tao that the Zen mind is the empty mind. In the New Testament, the correlative to this is be ye as a little child. Because a little child knows that they don't know, so they are teachable. That is what spirituality gives us. It removes the clutter of the worldly voice so that the voice of the small, still voice within can then move forward in our consciousness. So what we did was we meditated. What we did was we spent a few minutes in silence, and we said a prayer before the meditation, and it was to surrender to God our opinions, to surrender to God how I feel about abortion, one way or the other. At the end of our meditation time, we had a conversation about abortion. And it was described, a young man said to me the next day, he said, last night I feel like I had an intimate conversation about abortion with 2,000 people in my living room. Because what happened was the level of conversation was so deep. And I think people who have the most to say on the issue are keeping their mouths shut. Because your deepest feelings about that issue are usually whether it is that you had an abortion, or you needed to have an abortion, or you feel so strongly why you shouldn't have abortions, comes from a place that wouldn't be interested in all of that. But people spoke from their hearts that night, on both sides of the question. And there were people who I know, and I was among them, who heard somebody talking in a way that their political conclusion was the opposite of mine, but I heard them for the first time. I really heard it. And the reason it was such a powerful night for me, and I think for many other people as well, is because, as the Course in Miracles would say, the answer is not pro-choice or anti-choice. I refuse to call it pro-life, because those of us who are pro-choice are just as pro-life as anyone else. More so. I don't think more so. I just think we have as much of a dedication to life. And the Course in Miracles would say the answer is not pro-choice or anti-choice, pro-life, whatever. The answer, the Course in Miracles says, is the answer with a capital A. And that was that we hear each other on that level. But that does not mean that we do not have a passionate debate. It does not mean that we are afraid to disagree with each other. Take someone like Hillary Clinton. For me personally, she's one of the great women of American history. You know, I think she's one of the great women of American history. If we were going to be voting on great transformational women of the century, I'd be up there, well, let's put Hillary Clinton on the list. It is not an anti-Hillary position to say that I do not believe that her positions and the way she holds herself politically, not personally, but politically. None of us should be afraid. You're in Iowa. You have a tremendous responsibility right now to vote. You know, in these caucuses, I don't need to tell anybody from Iowa this. You are going to send a message. There's something about beginnings. There's something about beginnings. Beginnings, it's very difficult to change a system once the beginning has already been established and the trajectory has been established. So I think what's important here is just that we have a conversation about consciousness, about spirituality, about politics. And then from that, you will vote, you will behave in your caucus however you feel moved. I'm really honored that you would give me the opportunity to speak to why I believe, not that I think he's a better person than Hillary Clinton or Governor Malloy or O'Malley. I was going to say not Malloy, it's Ed Malloy, damn, O'Malley. Malloy, not Malloy. This isn't about who's a better person for me. And I share, with many people just a real pride in that democratic debate because of the sort of tenor of the conversation. And I think that's what's important for us as spiritual seekers to know. You're not being negative. You're not tearing someone else down if you keep the conversation on a high level. And that's what I believe that Bernie Sanders has done. This is not about tearing down anybody on a personal level. Tearing people down on a personal level, and as Dan said, I've run for office. I've been there. It was the most exhilarating experience of my life, but also the most brutal experience of my life. But the part that's exhilarating is so beautiful. The part that we can even have this conversation. Americans take too much for granted. Religious freedom being an example. Separation of church and state is one of the most enlightened principles of the Constitution of the United States. But it was not established in order to suppress the religious or spiritual conversation. It was established in order to protect and liberate the spiritual and political conversation. We were taught when we were children about how people came here for religious freedom. That you and I live in a country. There are countries where if the Maharishi University wanted to establish itself, there are people who would say, no, not on the list. It's against the law to do it. You can't do that in this country. Jefferson said, whether a man believes in 20 gods or no gods, neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. So what we're doing here is so important, but it is not a guaranteed right in all of the countries of the world that we can even be talking about what we're talking about here. And so I believe very strongly. I believe it as a steward as a citizen, that we are all stewards of our democracy, as I said. But I also believe it very strongly as a spiritual seeker. If when people talk about how it's all illusion, I'm a student of the Course in Miracles, and definitely on a theological level, the idea there is that everything that is the three dimensions is a giant mortal hallucination. That is true, but the Course in Miracles says do not foster level confusion. If, God forbid, someone in this auditorium right now keeled over and couldn't breathe, we wouldn't say, well, it's just an illusion anyway, let's just meditate. That's not what would happen. Ed would jump up, he'd say, okay, who's a doctor? We need doctors and nurses, everybody else, somebody call 911, everybody would get out. We would act like mature adults. Like I said, the people among us who are the spiritual seekers should be the biggest adults in the society. We should be the most mature adults. We should not allow ourselves to be infantilized by a faux notion of what it means to be spiritual. And just as it's true that if someone keeled over here tonight, we would all be mature adults very quickly. We should be mature adults about the fact that 14,000 children are starving every day. We should be mature adults about the fact that 1 in 4 American children are food insecure. We should be mature adults about the absolute immorality and even evil of a for-profit prison system in the United States. We should be mature adults about the dismantling of our democracy. We should be mature adults about our need for a constitutional amendment that should establish public funding of all federal campaigns. So, as I said before, I don't think the American people are going to go with an establishment voice. They're going to go, Americans have an instinctive knowing something's going on, something's coming up from the bottom of things, that's number one. And even if they do go for an establishment voice, no one who is entrenched within the perspective of the status quo is going to lead us out of the miasma that we are in now. That is my belief. If it is not your belief, I certainly honor that. I certainly welcome the opportunity that tonight in our discussion of issues, we can come from a place, whether we agree or don't agree, where you will give me an opportunity, and I appreciate that, to talk about how I think and why I think that Bernie Sanders is the one who speaks with the moral authority, who actually challenges, doesn't just pussyfoot around it, but actually challenges the status quo and talks not only about where we need to be fierce in our no, but also fierce in our yes. And as we do that, we will prepare the ground for the interruption of something that needs to be interrupted. It's not just this country. This entire human race right now is like on the Titanic headed for the iceberg. That iceberg could be nuclear. That iceberg could be biochemical. There are so many forms that the iceberg could take. We must turn this ship around. And what happened in the original Titanic is that the captain of the ship knew they shouldn't go into those northern waters. The captain of the ship knew that what they were doing was dangerous. He was shouted down by the money man. We must not be shouted down by the money man. And we must not be shouted down by the weaver of tales. And one of the tales being woven right now is the electability factor. If I hear one more person saying, well, I got to go for Hillary because we really need the Supreme Court, like the rest of us don't understand that concept and we need to be educated. The extraordinary patronizing and condescension of those who pat you on the head if you're a Bernie supporter, you just don't understand. Oh, we understand. Okay? The electability argument is that Hillary will be elected, and believe me, if Hillary is the nominee, I will be working as hard as anybody else to get her elected. But I would like to take a moment to challenge the electability factor argument, because who's going to decide this argument is not Republicans. Who's going to decide in the general election is not Democrats. Who's going to decide in the general election is not the old, and it is not the young. It is not the blacks, it is not the Latinos, it is not the women, it is not anybody. I'll tell you who it is the independents. Because the independent voter is now 43 to 44% of all registered voters in the United States. This is all a charade, all of this unholy alliance between the Democrats and the Republicans. The very fact that 43 to 44% of our population is registered as an independent shows that. And among poll after poll after poll, among the independents, their favorites are Trump, Carson, and Bernie. And Hillary is 7th. So I say that not out of disrespect. I have no disrespect for Mrs. Clinton, but I do have disrespect for the corporatized version of the Democratic Party. I remember a time when the Democratic Party had courage, and I just don't understand how we are going to lead the charge in the decorporatization of the country if we're not willing to decorporatize the Democratic Party. I don't understand it. It was simply a bad move. Should corporations exist? Of course. Should people be able to make a lot of money in America? Of course. But everybody should have a shot at it in America. And if you do not have an allegiance to that basic idea that everybody should have a reasonable shot at it in America, then you are not radically committed to the whole ideal that is American democracy. And if you are committed to it, but you are not committed during a campaign season to the possible voices and the possible trajectory and vortex by which it will change, then in my mind, your politics are not aligned with the most fierce protection of that American ideal. And for me, where do I get people say to me, where do you get this willingness to just go out there and say it like you see it? I pray, I meditate. You pray, you meditate. You can't help but kick ass. Thank you very, very much.